Welcome everyone to Things Around 8. Dear friends, in this video we will talk about a recent statement by Vladimir Putin, who reported that nearly 700,000 Russian soldiers are now deployed in Ukraine, a number that, according to the Kremlin, could soon reach 1 million. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any news. On Friday, June 14th, Vladimir Putin, during a televised event attended by several decorated Russian military personnel, said that almost 700,000 Russian troops are currently fighting in Ukraine, a substantial increase compared to the 617,000 troops that Putin said in December 2023 were directly involved in his war, and a huge increase compared to the 180,000 that, according to many sources, formed the first wave of the Russian attack at the beginning of the invasion on February 24, 2022. This contingent of 700,000 Russian troops on the front line makes that war one of the largest conflicts in recent decades worldwide. Just for comparison, at the height of the United States intervention in the Vietnam War, Washington maintained a number of troops in that theater of operations that never exceeded 540,000. And in the specific case of Russia, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, Moscow never maintained more than 120,000 troops on the ground. But what does this contingent of 700,000 Russians in Ukraine really say about the current state of the conflict? And how is Russia managing to keep such a large contingent of fighters on the front line? This may seem like a pretty obvious thing to say, but it is important to emphasize this point. Wars are very expensive events indeed, and this cost increases exponentially as the number of soldiers and vehicles directly involved increases. It is also important to emphasize the dual nature of this cost. There is the direct cost of keeping soldiers clothed, fed, hydrated, armed and in good health on the battlefield, an area that is usually very unhealthy and obviously very dangerous. Vehicles and aircraft also represent a large portion of this cost, as they need to have fuel and spare parts available to be able to operate daily in terribly harsh and challenging conditions, both for men and machines. Therefore, the estimated cost of maintaining 700,000 soldiers on the front line in active combat, supported by thousands of transport vehicles, combat vehicles and aircraft, varies, according to some sources, between $700 and $800 million per day. In other words, almost $1 billion per day, to maintain a force of 700,000 soldiers in the war. But there are also indirect costs. The Russian soldiers who are in the war are young men of working age, generally men between 20 and 45 years old, who in order to be there invading Ukraine, were removed from their businesses and jobs, many of them in the private sector. Considering that about 40% of the Russian population works for the state, of the contingent of 700,000 soldiers, at least 420,000 were removed from private sector jobs, converting them into 420,000 new civil servants who need to be maintained by the Russian state, obviously increasing the cost of the state to operate. The way Putin found to maintain such a gigantic fighting force, and to manage a daily direct cost of almost $1 billion, was through the complete militarization of the Russian economy, something that was last done in Russia between 1941 and 1945, during World War II. At that time, with the Soviet Union under attack by almost 4 million Axis troops, Stalin had no alternative but to convert all Soviet businesses and industries into war-oriented businesses. Factories that produce pans, refrigerators and passenger cars have been converted into factories for the production of weapons, ammunition, vehicles and warplanes, with Putin gradually doing something very similar in Russia, with the biggest sign of this having been given in May of this year with the dismissal of Sergei Shoigu as defense minister, replaced by Andrei Belizov, an economist with no military experience. The fact that Putin chose an economics professor as Russia's defense minister proves that his goal is to prepare the country for a very long and exhausting war. A war that he knows will soon involve more than 1 million Russian soldiers and that, therefore, can only be maintained if the Russian economy is 100% militarized, just as Stalin did in the 1940s. The militarization of the economy is not something a leader does lightly, as it generates a huge impact on society in the medium and long term, with items such as televisions, refrigerators and even passenger cars gradually ceasing to be available to the population. The state also becomes excessively fat and bloated, and depending on the duration of the war and the level of militarization of the economy, the state can become the main employer of labor for an entire nation, causing many private companies to go bankrupt due to a lack of labor to keep their businesses running and a lack of buyers for their products. But in the short term, the militarization of the economy of a country at war is very positive, and that is what we are seeing now in Russia, with unemployment at minimum levels and the economy growing. But, as I said, in the medium and long term, as the war drags on and the economy becomes increasingly nationalized and militarized, the impact will be progressively more negative, with the process of demilitarizing the economy also becoming increasingly difficult, as it will involve the return of hundreds of thousands of people to a post-militarization civilian life, in which many industries and services simply cease to exist during the militarization phase of the economy. Putin is obviously well aware of all these challenges, and he knows that the war he started in Ukraine will continue for many years to come, and will increasingly consume more of his country's human, financial, and material resources. And that is why he has appointed an economics professor as the head of Russia's most important ministry at the moment. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any news.